My name is Thompson Clark, and in this video I'll share my story of attempting to solve 11 Rubik's Cubes underwater and how I blacked out and went unconscious trying to do so. But if you want to skip the story and just see the action, you can go ahead and fast forward to whatever this timestamp is here. But for those of you who want the details, let me start by explaining why I tried to solve 11 Rubik's Cubes underwater. And it started with researching about the sport of freediving, in which the best divers in the world can dive down to depths of over 100 meters and come back up over the course of multiple minutes. And although I had no interest in freediving myself, it did make me curious to know what I could accomplish with cubing if I trained my breath holding abilities in the same way. And so over the course of a few months, I improved my breath hold record from 2 minutes to 3 minutes to 3.5 minutes, and then eventually 4 minutes, at which point I said, okay, maybe I'll hold here because quite honestly, it doesn't seem that healthy to hold your breath for much longer than that, in my opinion. But keep in mind that my 4-minute record is for what's called static apnea, which is basically just holding your breath while remaining as still as possible, trying to conserve oxygen and reduce CO2 buildup in your body. But what I quickly realized was that 4 minutes of static apnea does not necessarily translate to 4 minutes of being able to solve Rubik's Cubes while holding your breath. And in fact, I could probably only go about 3 minutes max solving Rubik's Cubes while holding my breath, which really goes to show how much energy and oxygen your brain and body are using doing something that even seems so muscle memory as it does for us speed cubers. But even with a window of 3 minutes and knowing that I'm well below being a sub 10 second Rubik's Cube solver, I quickly realized that the world record, and in fact the Guinness World Record, was actually very much achievable. Now, at the time that I did my attempt, the official world record, as recognized by Guinness World Records, was held by Ilayaram Sekar from India, solving 6 cubes in a time of 2 minutes, 13 seconds. But honestly, I never saw 6 cubes as the record to beat because, as many cubers would know, Kevin Hayes had solved 10 cubes underwater in a high-stakes environment. And even though it wasn't officially recognized by Guinness, it was official in my books. So for me, doing anything less than 11 cubes was really not an option because otherwise I wouldn't have been accomplishing anything that nobody else had done before. So I practiced numerous times, making sure I could successfully solve 11 Rubik's Cubes underwater. And the first time I did it took about 2 minutes, 38 seconds. Second time was 2:34, and I would average around 2:35, which meant I was averaging under 15 seconds per cube pretty easily. And so I felt very confident about achieving the record. And with that, I'll stop talking and show you the clip that you've been waiting for. And then afterwards, we'll rewatch and I'll do some voiceover of the highlights and explain everything for those interested.
Okay.
Attaboy. You got it.
Oh my God.
Holy. Well.
He broke it after 6.
Hopefully you've caught your breath since seeing that, because now we'll go over the key parts in detail. We're going to start our analysis in the breathe up before I actually submerge for the attempt. And I want to start by talking about these deep breaths I'm taking, which is oxygenating my body and at the same time purging carbon dioxide or CO2, which basically is what people would call hyperventilation. Now, there's a dangerous but common misconception out there that if you're trying to hold your breath for a long time, you should hyperventilate before you submerge. And I will explain why that's actually so dangerous, even though I chose to do so. But first, I think it's worth explaining that it's not actually the depletion of oxygen that gives us the urge to breathe, but rather it's the buildup of CO2, which gives us that uncomfortable feeling in our stomach and chest and throat. Keep in mind that I am not a scientist or a doctor, but let me try to explain with this diagram of a normal dive without hyperventilation. We can imagine that any underwater breath hold, or a dive as we'll be calling it here, is split into 3 phases, which is our normal breathing phase, our actual dive, and then the recovery breathing afterwards. Before a dive, our body has a certain level of oxygen and a certain level of CO2 already. And as we dive, our oxygen levels decrease, and in exchange, CO2 rises. If our oxygen level lowers to a point of true danger, this is where blackout happens. But in normal circumstances, before the point of blackout, our CO2 levels will have risen to the point of triggering us to take a breath. And so hopefully by the time that we've hit that CO2 ceiling, we're ready to take that breath, we don't reach the point of blackout, and our oxygen and CO2 levels can normalize after. Okay, but now let's reset and see what happens with hyperventilation before holding our breath. In this scenario, we'll start with the same amount of oxygen, but you can see we've purged our body of CO2 so that by the time we go underwater, our levels are very low. And because of that, this time our oxygen level hits the blackout zone before our body even receives the trigger to tell us it's time to take a breath. With all that explained, you're probably wondering why I chose to hyperventilate, and the reason is because having less CO2 in your body would make the attempt far more comfortable, and also because I didn't expect to have to be submerged long enough to actually hit my natural point of blackout. My plan was to be finished solving 11 cubes in around 2 minutes 30 seconds, which for me wouldn't have been super risky. But obviously it was incredibly dangerous, and I hope you can see why you should never hyperventilate before going underwater, because you will black out more easily, and if you don't have anyone to recover you, then you can easily die from it. Okay, now let's move on from all that breath talk, and here I am actually submerged. Notice how I make this big movement to balance myself underwater because I felt myself floating up and I wanted to be completely submerged the entire time. After I did that, I thought, oh man, I'm already wasting so much oxygen with unnecessary movement. But anytime I have thoughts like that, I have to try to push them away and just focus on the cubing. Here I am on my 4th cube, and at this point I still feel very little stress, but you can see I finished the 4th cube at over a minute, so my pacing was definitely already slow at that point. Something you'll notice is that I actually can't see the next cube until I've completely solved my last one. And even though that's the way that I was practicing, not having that time to plan what you're doing ahead of time definitely is the biggest negative impact on your speed. Now here I am on cube number 8, and I actually knew this during the attempt because every 4th cube had black plastic and the cubes in between were stickerless. At this point, I'm definitely starting to feel the CO2 buildup, but I know that I just have to push past for 3 more cubes, and so at that point I still felt quite confident. Onward to cube number 11, and I'm definitely fighting at this point. And all seemed to be going okay until the last algorithm, and cubers can see that I end with a V permutation, and I make a mistake on the very last move. Unfortunately, I don't realize it, and that cube is not considered solved. But here I am thinking that I've just broken the record, and I'll try to push it to 12 cubes. But at this point, I've already been underwater for way longer than I had planned, and I didn't know it. At this point, you can see air bubbles escaping my body, and after a few more seconds, just before 3 minutes, this is where I lose consciousness. And to explain what I'm feeling in this moment, the answer is nothing. The last thing that I remember is starting to solve the 12th cube, and then basically I instantly fall asleep underwater. What's interesting is that you can see me just sitting there with the cube in my hand for a solid 8 seconds or so, which shows the initial shutdown of my advanced motor skills, but my basic motor skills don't shut down until a bit later. You can see my body trying to get itself to the surface and the contractions in my stomach basically forcing me to breathe if I'm able to, all the while I'm unconscious. At this point, I've been taken out of the water, but like I said, none of this I remember. All I know is I was solving my 12th cube, and then the next moment, I'm waking up in this reclined, seated position. And that's my story. I appreciate if you made it to the end of the video, and I hope that you at least learned a thing or two about underwater cubing and water safety. I definitely learned a lot for the next time that I try this many cubes or more. Take care.